It was a night like any other at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, where fine dining met sophistication. The lights glistened like stars against the dark wood interiors, and the clinking of glasses blended with the soft hum of distant conversations. For most patrons, this was a place to celebrate, to indulge, to enjoy the luxury that money could buy. But for one family, their night of celebration was about to turn into a nightmare. The Johnsons, a hard-working black family from the local neighborhood, had saved up for months to enjoy this special night out. It was their daughter's graduation, a momentous occasion, and they had been dreaming of this dinner for weeks. As they walked through the door, the waitstaff greeted them warmly, and for a moment, they felt like they belonged in this world of marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, and the smell of exquisite cuisine wafting through the air. They took their seats at a corner table, eager to savor the experience. But as the evening unfolded, something strange began to happen. Across the room, a wealthy white man, dressed in a crisp suit, sat at his table, glancing over at the Johnsons from time to time. At first it seemed harmless, even polite, but then the looks began to linger. His gaze shifted from curious to dismissive, and eventually to something colder. It wasn't long before he started making loud, cutting remarks, comments about the family's attire, about their presence in a place like this. His voice was dripping with condescension, his words laced with a kind of entitlement only someone accustomed to privilege could carry. He made sure everyone within earshot could hear. "Can you believe this?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, but his voice carried across the room. "How does a family like that even afford to be here?" The Johnsons tried to ignore him, hoping the moment would pass. But it didn't. Instead, the insults grew bolder. He mocked the way the father, Mr. Johnson, ordered his meal, then sneered when the waiter brought over the drinks. The laughter from the man's table echoed around the restaurant, as if it was all some kind of joke. The Johnsons, who had worked so hard to get to this moment, felt a rising tide of humiliation and anger. Yet, they held their ground, doing their best to maintain composure, unwilling to let this stranger ruin their celebration. But just as it seemed the night would spiral out of control, something unexpected happened. The waiter, who had been serving the man in the suit for most of the evening, approached the table with an unusual expression on his face. His steps were measured, and his demeanor was calm, but there was something different in the way he held himself. With a soft nod to the family, the waiter placed something discreetly on the man's plate, an envelope sealed shut. The man, clearly caught off guard, looked at the waiter, then back at the envelope. He tore it open without hesitation, curiosity etched on his face. As he read, his expression shifted. The arrogance in his eyes flickered for a split second, replaced by a hint of confusion. He glanced up at the waiter, and the room seemed to hold its breath. What was in that note? What had just happened? The atmosphere in the restaurant suddenly changed. The air grew heavier. The Johnsons exchanged puzzled glances. What was going on? Who was this waiter? And why had he handed the man that note? The whole room seemed to be waiting for something, but no one dared speak. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then the man's face turned pale, and he looked at the waiter again, as if expecting an explanation. The waiter, however, remained silent. The seconds stretched out like hours, and it felt as though time itself had stopped. What was the note about? Was this the moment when the tables would turn, when the arrogant millionaire would get what he deserved? The next few moments would change everything, but what would happen next was anyone's guess. Would the Johnsons be able to reclaim their dignity? Would the wealthy man face the consequences of his actions? Or would this night be forever remembered as a moment of injustice? The answers were just a whisper away. The room fell silent as the wealthy man stared at the note in his hand, his fingers twitching slightly as if unsure what to do next. The waiter, a young man named David, stood at the edge of the table, his expression calm but tense. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life, and now that it had arrived, he was ready to face whatever came next. He stood straight, shoulders squared, his eyes meeting the man's, but there was no hint of fear in his gaze. only quiet certainty. For a moment, the wealthy man said nothing. His hand tightened around the envelope, crumpling the edges as his brow furrowed. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he glanced around the room, clearly aware of the growing attention his reaction was drawing. There was something about this note, something that had clearly unsettled him, and the tension in the air only seemed to grow thicker. The Johnsons, who had been trying to stay focused on their own meal, couldn't help but glance over, curiosity tugging at them. They had no idea what was in that note, but the way the man was acting, something wasn't right. Mr. Johnson, the father of the family, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had always prided himself on keeping his composure in public, no matter the situation. But tonight, after enduring the man's blatant disrespect, he felt a surge of anger rising inside him again. What could possibly be so important in that note? Was it a threat? A warning? Or was it something that could finally put that arrogant man in his place? The family exchanged looks, but they said nothing. They had no idea who this waiter was or why he had done what he did, but a part of them couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when someone would finally stand up to the type of person who thought their money and status gave them the right to humiliate others. The millionaire, still clutching the crumpled envelope, slowly placed it down on the table. His hands were visibly shaking now, his jaw clenched tight, and for the first time that night, the self-assurance he had carried with him since entering the restaurant seemed to falter. He looked at David, his mouth opening and closing, as if trying to find the words, but nothing came out. It was as if he had been stripped of his power, left vulnerable and unsure, and that unsettling feeling grew stronger with each passing second. Across the room, the waitstaff was watching closely, but they said nothing. The other diners, sensing the change in the atmosphere, shifted uneasily in their seats, glancing at each other in confusion. Whispers spread from table to table, but no one dared approach the scene directly. The air was electric, charged with anticipation. What was going to happen? What was in the note that had caused such a visible shift in the millionaire's demeanor? David, the waiter, remained motionless. His eyes locked with the millionaire's, his expression as steady as ever. He had a story to tell, a story he had been waiting to share for years. But now, in this moment, he wasn't going to say a word. Not yet. The Johnsons watched the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and disbelief. For a brief moment, the man across the room, who had once seemed like an untouchable figure, now seemed small, almost insignificant. It was a feeling they weren't used to, but it felt strangely empowering. Mr. Johnson looked down at his hands, clenched tightly in his lap. His anger hadn't disappeared, but he knew better than to act impulsively. He had to see where this would go. This could be the moment when everything changed, when the balance of power in the room shifted. But how and why? The minutes seemed to stretch into eternity. Still, the millionaire did not speak. His gaze flickered back and forth between David and the crumpled note on the table, as if trying to make sense of something that didn't fit into his world. He had been raised with privilege, raised to believe that people like him always had control, that the rules didn't apply to him. But this was different. Whatever this note was, it had shattered that illusion. Finally, with a shaky breath, the millionaire stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He reached for the envelope, but David was quicker, placing a hand firmly on top of it before he could. The room held its breath as David looked at the man, not with fear or defiance, but with something much more powerful, quiet, unyielding strength. "I think you need to read that in private," David said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of finality that left no room for argument. The millionaire's face twisted in frustration, but for the first time that evening, he held his tongue. Instead, he glanced at the waiter one more time, eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge whether this was some kind of elaborate prank. But there was no mistaking the sincerity in David's eyes. Something real was happening here, something that could not be ignored. Slowly, the man returned to his seat, and the tension in the room began to ease ever so slightly. The Johnsons, who had been watching in stunned silence, exchanged another look. What had just happened? The millionaire sat back down, his eyes no longer full of arrogance, but of something else, something that almost resembled fear. He picked up his glass of wine and took a long sip, his hand trembling just slightly. It was as if he was trying to steady himself, but nothing seemed to help. David turned away and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving the millionaire alone with the mystery of the note. As he moved, he caught the eye of the restaurant manager, who gave him a subtle nod, as if acknowledging the role he had just played. The waiter's calm, measured steps were the only sound now, except for the quiet murmur of the other guests, still whispering about what they had just witnessed. Meanwhile, Mr. Johnson leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He had seen it. He had seen that shift in the millionaire's expression. Whatever was happening here, it was clear that it was bigger than him, bigger than his family. This wasn't just about a few rude comments at a restaurant anymore. This was something personal, something that went deeper than wealth or status. What was in that note? And why had the waiter been the one to deliver it? The questions hung in the air, unresolved, as the evening stretched on. And as the Johnsons tried to focus on their meal, that strange feeling of anticipation lingered. Something was about to happen, and it felt like they were all on the verge of witnessing something that would change everything. The room had fallen back into a quiet hum, but the air still felt thick with unspoken tension. The millionaire, now sitting at his table with the note in front of him, seemed lost in his thoughts. His previous arrogance had been replaced by something else, something more vulnerable, more exposed. As he picked at his food absent-mindedly, his mind was racing. What had just happened? What could possibly be in that note that had shaken him to his core? The waiter, David, had already disappeared behind the kitchen doors, but his presence lingered in the atmosphere like a shadow. No one knew exactly what had just transpired, but the subtle shift in the millionaire's demeanor was impossible to ignore. Even the staff, who had been so accustomed to serving the wealthiest clients, seemed to watch him with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. David was not just any waiter, and the fact that he had remained calm through the entire ordeal only added to the mystery. There was something about him, something deeper than the simple role he played in this upscale restaurant. The other staff members could sense it. They had seen the way he had handled the situation, how he had remained unshaken, while the millionaire squirmed. But they had no idea what was going on. No one did. David had worked at the restaurant for years, quietly observing the people who came in, the high-profile figures who thought their money and status could buy them anything. He had seen it all, the subtle racism, the blatant discrimination, the way people like the millionaire would look down on others simply because of the color of their skin, or the way they dressed, or the way they carried themselves. But there was something different about tonight. Something had triggered him, something deep within. As he moved through the kitchen, David's thoughts were clouded. He had been planning this moment for years. Tonight wasn't random. It was carefully orchestrated. But why had he chosen this night? Why had he chosen the Johnsons, a family he didn't even know personally? The answer was simple. David had watched them for weeks, watched them come into the restaurant time and time again, always with the same hopeful look on their faces. They were always polite, always kind, but always treated with a certain coldness by the higher-end clientele. He had seen the way they were ignored by the waitstaff when they were seated, the way the manager had brushed them off with a forced smile, and it broke his heart. But it wasn't just about them. It was about all the families who came in, hoping for a taste of a life they could never quite reach. David had been there too. He had been one of them. He knew what it felt like to work long hours, to save every penny, and still never feel like you quite belong. He had been underestimated, ignored, and belittled. But tonight, he had a chance to make things right. He had a chance to expose the people who thought they were untouchable, and the time had come. The note wasn't just a message, it was a key to something bigger. Back at the table, the Johnsons continued to eat in silence. The weight of the situation hung over them like a storm cloud. They had come to this restaurant with high hopes to celebrate their daughter's graduation, but now they were caught in something much more complicated. Mr. Johnson, usually the calm and collected one, could feel his anger bubbling again. The man who had humiliated them earlier had yet to apologize, had yet to even acknowledge his behavior. The more he thought about it, the more the injustice of the situation gnawed at him. But it wasn't just the millionaire who had angered him, it was the whole system. The system that made people like him feel small and invisible. The system that placed value on appearances, on wealth, on status. The system that told people like the Johnsons they didn't belong in places like this, no matter how hard they worked or how much they deserved it. It was a system that made them feel like outsiders in their own city, like their presence was an intrusion. And that man, that millionaire, was a symbol of that system. His words, his sneers, his dismissive attitude, they were all part of the same problem. Mrs. Johnson, on the other hand, was trying her best to stay calm. She had seen her husband's temper flare up in moments like this before, and she knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. She placed a hand on his arm, trying to steady him. "Let's not let him ruin our night," she whispered softly, though her voice trembled slightly. "We're here for Kelsey, for her graduation. Don't let him take that away from us." Kelsey, their daughter, smiled at her parents, though she could tell they were both struggling. She had seen the way the man across the room had looked at them, the way he had made them feel small. But she had also seen the way her parents carried themselves, with dignity, even in the face of cruelty. It wasn't always easy, but she admired them for it. She had grown up watching them fight for their place in the world, always rising above the challenges, always with grace. But tonight, something was different. She could feel it too. The tension in the air wasn't just about the millionaire. It was about something bigger, something that had been building for a long time. Kelsey's thoughts were interrupted when she noticed the waiter, David, stepping back into the dining room. He glanced at the Johnsons briefly before moving toward the kitchen again, but there was something different in his posture. There was a quiet intensity to him now, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like he knew something they didn't. She caught his eye for a moment, and in that brief exchange, she saw something in his gaze, something that spoke to her, something that said, "Asterisk, you're not alone, asterisk." Back at the millionaire's table, the note was still on the table, unopened. His eyes kept darting between the crumpled paper and the glass of wine in his hand. He knew he had to read it, but part of him was afraid. Afraid of what it would reveal. Afraid of what he would have to confront. His entire life had been built on this illusion of power and control. What would it mean if that illusion was shattered? His mind drifted back to his earlier thoughts, to the family at the corner table. Who were they? What right did they have to be there, in the same space as him? They didn't belong, not in his world. He had made that clear. But now, with the note in front of him, something inside him shifted. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was unsettling. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. And now, with every passing second, the pressure was building. Something had changed. He just didn't know how or why, yet. The minutes seemed to crawl by, each one heavier than the last. The $1 million dinner, once a symbol of indulgence, now felt suffocating. Mr. Johnson's gaze kept flicking toward the millionaire, who sat motionless at his table, his eyes fixed on the crumpled note. The restaurant, full of chatter and laughter, felt distant, as though the drama unfolding between those two tables had drawn a thin, invisible line that separated them from the rest of the world. Mr. Johnson clenched his fists under the table. His thoughts churned, but he wasn't sure what to do. There was an instinct in him, a deep-seated need to confront the man, to demand an apology for the cruelty, for the arrogance. But something in David's behavior held him back. The waiter had given no indication that he was finished with the millionaire. The note wasn't just a message, it was a signal. Whatever it was meant to set things in motion, but to what end? The unknown still loomed, and the longer the millionaire sat there, the more impossible it seemed to simply walk away. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Mrs. Johnson, always the voice of reason, felt her own unease. She had been watching David closely, trying to understand what had happened. The way he had handled the situation with such quiet confidence. It wasn't just about a job, it was personal. But why? What was driving him? And why had he chosen to involve them? The more she thought about it, the more she realized how little they actually knew about the waiter. But there was something in his eyes when he'd walked past earlier, something that made her feel as though they were part of a much bigger picture than they could possibly understand. She couldn't shake the feeling that tonight wasn't about a simple dining experience. It was something much deeper, something dangerous. Kelsey, too, felt it. Her stomach churned with unease, the uncertainty of it all gnawing at her. Her parents were too calm, too composed, but she could see it in their eyes. The same confusion, the same sense of anticipation. She wanted to ask David what he had meant by that note. She wanted to know what was coming next, but she didn't dare speak. The atmosphere was charged. They were all waiting for something to break. What had David set in motion? What had the millionaire read that had made him so unhinged? Across the room, the millionaire sat perfectly still. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his eyes now scanning the note, but his focus was fractured. The world around him seemed distant, blurred. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of voices, none of it registered. His mind was locked in a battle with the note in front of him, his hands trembling ever so slightly. The longer he stared at the paper, the more it seemed to burn him. His once impenetrable world, built on the foundations of wealth, status, and control, was crumbling before his eyes. He knew he couldn't stay here much longer. He had to do something. The note wasn't just a message, it was a revelation, and it was pulling the rug from beneath him. How had this happened? How had it all come to this? In the quiet corner of the room, David had returned to the back, but his mind was anything but calm. His hands, though steady in the presence of the millionaire, now clenched into fists behind the kitchen counter. He had seen the look in the millionaire's eyes. He had seen the way the man's composure was cracking, how he could no longer hide behind the mask of superiority. This was the moment he had been waiting for. But even now, as the seconds ticked by, David didn't feel the relief he thought he would. Instead, a new layer of uncertainty had settled in. What would happen when the millionaire finally stood up? What would the man do with the knowledge he now held? Would he lash out, or would he collapse under the weight of his own guilt? David's heart raced as he thought about the consequences. He had carefully orchestrated this moment, every word in the note a piece of a larger puzzle. But he hadn't expected it to feel so real. He hadn't expected the overwhelming sense of responsibility that came with delivering a message like this, one that had the potential to alter everything. It wasn't just about humiliation. It wasn't just about justice. It was about power. The kind of power that people like the millionaire took for granted, the kind that was invisible to most, yet omnipresent. And David had the opportunity to challenge that, to expose it for what it was. But it was too late to turn back now. He had already made his choice. The next move was out of his hands. Back at the table, the millionaire's patience finally snapped. He reached for the note again, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded it. It had been minutes, but for him, it felt like hours. He scanned the words, his expression shifting with every line, as though the note was peeling back layers of his carefully constructed world. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was read the words that burned into his mind. It was then that he stood up suddenly, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His face had gone pale, and his eyes were wide, a mixture of disbelief and something darker. The shock on his face was so profound that even the other diners in the restaurant began to take notice, their conversations dropping to murmurs. David had re-entered the dining room, and when his eyes met the millionaire's, the two exchanged a brief, intense look. The tension was unbearable. The millionaire took a few steps toward David, his hand trembling as he reached for something, his wallet or his phone, or maybe something else entirely. But the moment was too heavy, the space too thick with the unknown. The Johnsons, who had been watching intently, leaned forward, their breaths held, waiting for the explosion that seemed inevitable. But instead of a confrontation, the millionaire simply froze. His hand lowered slowly, and his gaze turned downward. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He was trapped, caught in the quiet aftershock of something he couldn't control. The air seemed to grow colder. And as the rest of the restaurant waited, wondering what would happen next, the Johnsons could feel it too. The change in the room, the shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't just a night at a luxury restaurant anymore. This was the culmination of something far bigger, something that would define the rest of their lives. They didn't know what it meant yet. They didn't know what the note contained, or why the millionaire was suddenly paralyzed. But in that moment, they could feel it, the power of the unknown, the anticipation of a storm that was only just beginning to brew. And no one, not the Johnsons, not David, not the millionaire, no one knew what would happen when it finally broke. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the weight of what had just transpired. The millionaire, still standing at the center of the dining area, hadn't moved for what felt like an eternity. His gaze was fixed downward, his hand trembling as he clutched the crumpled note. The silence stretched, stretching until it became almost unbearable. David, watching from the sidelines, felt his heart race. This was the moment, the one he had been waiting for, but it wasn't going the way he had imagined. Just when the millionaire seemed about to crumble, the unexpected happened. A voice, calm yet dripping with authority, broke through the quiet. Well, if it isn't the great Sebastian Warren, reduced to this. All heads turned in an instant, and the restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath as a figure entered the scene. A woman impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit strolled into the dining room with the kind of confidence that could silence a room. Her presence was magnetic, commanding attention from every corner. She wasn't just walking, she was projecting like someone who owned every inch of the space they stepped into, and she was looking straight at the millionaire. Sebastian Warren, his eyes wide with shock, glanced up at her, a sudden flush of color draining from his face. His jaw tightened as he tried to regain his composure. "Victoria," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "Victoria." The name rang out with an unmistakable weight. No one in the restaurant had seen her before, but something about the way Sebastian reacted, his inability to hide his discomfort, spoke volumes. The Johnsons, who had been so focused on the unfolding drama between the millionaire and David, suddenly found themselves watching this new arrival with equal curiosity. David's instincts flared. He had no idea who this woman was, but there was something about her. Her very presence seemed to shake Sebastian, and as she had the power to do that, she was important. More important than anyone had anticipated. David's mind raced. What was her role in all this? Why had she shown up now, just when things were on the brink of unraveling? Victoria didn't wait for an invitation. She moved closer, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, each step deliberate, each moment adding to the palpable tension in the room. She stopped just a few feet from Sebastian, her eyes narrowing as she sized him up. "You've really outdone yourself this time, haven't you?" she said, her tone sharp and almost mocking. "Humiliating a family over dinner. What are you, 12? Sebastian's face turned red, a combination of anger and embarrassment. "This is none of your business, Victoria," he replied, his voice betraying the crack in his facade. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Victoria's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't one of kindness. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know they hold all the cards, when they can break someone without lifting a finger. She turned her gaze to the Johnsons, who had been watching this exchange intently. Her eyes softened to just slightly, the first sign of any vulnerability in her demeanor. "I'm sorry for the way he's treated you," she said, her voice changing just enough to show a hint of sincerity. But then, as quickly as the warmth appeared, it vanished, replaced by the same cool detachment. "But I think you'll find that his little games are far from over." The Johnsons exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Johnson's hand tightened around her husband's, but neither of them knew how to respond. They had no idea who this woman was or why she was suddenly involved, but it was clear from the way she spoke to Sebastian that she had power over him, power they hadn't anticipated. And then, as if to seal the mystery, Victoria turned her gaze back to David, who had been standing in the background, silently watching the exchange. There was no hesitation in her eyes. She knew exactly who he was. "David," she said, her voice like silk, "I didn't expect to see you here." The air seemed to freeze at the sound of his name. David's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped to stay in the shadows, to remain anonymous as he set the wheels of change into motion. But this woman, Victoria, had seen through that veil instantly. She knew him. And worse, she seemed to know everything. "Victoria," David replied, his voice measured but tinged with unease. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was something about her presence that unnerved him. She wasn't just another wealthy socialite, she was something more. Someone who held secrets, and secrets that could shatter everything he had planned. "I see you've been busy," she said, a knowing glint in her eyes. "But you know as well as I do that you're not in control here. Not anymore." David's pulse quickened. What was she talking about? What did she know? He had orchestrated this moment with precision, and now it was slipping from his grasp. The tension in the room escalated. The power dynamic had shifted once again, and now the Johnsons were caught in the middle of it all, struggling to understand the layers of this unfolding drama. Sebastian, visibly rattled, finally broke his silence. "What do you want, Victoria? I've already done my part. Why are you even here?" His voice wavered, revealing just how much he had underestimated her influence. Victoria's smile deepened, and she took a step closer to him. "You think you can just walk away from this? From everything you've done? From the people you've ruined? You can't hide from me. Not anymore." Her words seemed to cut through the air like a blade, and for a moment, Sebastian looked almost defeated. But then his expression hardened again. He straightened up, trying to reclaim the remnants of his pride. But even as he did, the room felt like it was closing in on him. David's mind was racing. Whatever game Victoria was playing, it was clear she had some kind of hold over Sebastian. And worse yet, it seemed like she was just as much a part of the twisted web David had been trying to untangle. As he looked at Victoria and then back at the millionaire, the pieces started to fall into place. This wasn't just about exposing Sebastian. It wasn't just about humiliating him or revealing his true nature. No, this was bigger than that, much bigger. There were forces at play here, forces David hadn't anticipated. The stakes had just been raised, and the game had changed entirely. With a final, chilling glance at the Johnsons, Victoria's voice cut through the tension again, but this time it was softer, almost a whisper. "You thought you were the only ones with power in this room." She looked directly at the Johnsons, her eyes locking onto theirs. "You've just walked into a game where everyone has something to lose, and nothing is as it seems." And with those words hanging in the air, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the storm to hit. The stakes had escalated to a level none of them could have predicted, and now no one could say who would come out on top. The room seemed to exhale collectively as Victoria's words hung in the air, like an invisible weight pressing down on everyone present. The tension that had been building for what felt like hours finally reached its breaking point. Sebastian, his pride now fully fractured, glared at Victoria, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and helplessness. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words never came. For the first time that evening, he seemed utterly powerless, trapped in a web he hadn't even realized he was caught in. David's pulse raced as he watched this play out. He had worked so hard, so meticulously, to orchestrate this moment. Yet now, with the stakes higher than ever, he realized that everything he thought he knew about the game was wrong. Victoria wasn't just some high society observer, she was the mastermind, the puppet master behind it all. The realization struck him like a thunderclap. What had begun as a simple act of revenge for the humiliation of his family was now a battle between forces far greater than he had anticipated. Victoria took a deliberate step towards Sebastian, her gaze unwavering. The power in the room shifted again, as if she were the only one who truly understood what was happening. Her eyes locked with the Johnsons, who had been silent this whole time, watching in stunned disbelief. They had no idea what to make of any of this, but they were caught now, swept up in a narrative that was beyond their control. Sebastian finally spoke, his voice low and desperate. "You've been playing me this whole time, haven't you? This was never about some dinner, was it?" His words were a half-breath, full of regret, but there was no turning back now. His empire of wealth and influence was crumbling in front of him, and he was powerless to stop it. Victoria's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a friendly one. "You still don't get it, do you? This wasn't about dinner. This wasn't even about you. It was about power. And who has it? You were just a pawn in a much bigger game." David felt a shiver run down his spine. He had been part of this game all along, but even he didn't understand the full scope of what was happening. The words had been written on the note, but they were only the beginning of something much deeper, something that had been years in the making. Then, as if to punctuate Victoria's words, a phone rang from the back of the restaurant. It was an odd interruption in the middle of this high-stakes confrontation, but it sent a ripple of confusion through the room. David's heart skipped a beat. It was his phone. He glanced at the screen. The name that flashed across it was one he hadn't expected to see. Detective Harper *. Victoria noticed his reaction, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sudden tension that gripped David. "I see you've been busy on more fronts than I thought," she said, her voice thick with amusement. "Don't think this game is over just yet." David's mind raced as he answered the phone, his hand trembling. "Harper," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What is it? What's going on?" The detective's voice crackled through the speaker, tense and urgent. "David, you need to listen carefully. We've been monitoring Warren for a while now. There's more to him than just his business dealings. He's connected to something much darker. I'm sending backup, but you need to get out of there, now." David froze, the phone slipping from his hand as his worst fears began to materialize. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the web to extend so far, or for the stakes to be so high. Victoria's smile never wavered, but her eyes gleamed with a dark satisfaction. She knew. She had known all along. She had orchestrated every move, every confrontation, and now, as the puzzle pieces clicked into place, David realized just how deep the game had gone. "You've been a part of this from the beginning, David," she said, her voice laced with an unsettling calm. "But this isn't just about getting revenge. This is about bringing down someone who's been getting away with far too much. And you're the final piece of the puzzle. You're the one who makes it all come together." David's mind reeled. He had started out thinking he was exposing Sebastian for the way he had treated his family, but now it felt like the whole world was closing in on him. He had been used, manipulated. The detective's warning echoed in his ears. The whole thing had been a trap set by people who knew far more than he could ever imagine. As David struggled to make sense of it all, the door to the restaurant swung open with a sudden force. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence an immediate shift in the room's energy. It wasn't just a coincidence. Detective Harper had been right. Backup had arrived. The millionaire, still standing there, looked from Victoria to the officers, his face pale as a realization hit him. But before he could react, one of the officers turned and locked eyes with the Johnsons. The moment stretched, and then everything happened in a blur. The officer walked directly toward them, his eyes narrowing as he reached for something at his side. In the chaos, a voice cut through the air, a familiar voice, one that David had not expected to hear again. "I thought I told you to leave him alone." David whipped around to see Kelsey, her face flushed with determination. She was standing in the doorway now, her hand gripping a small envelope, her eyes locked on Victoria. "I won't let you destroy my family," she said, her voice steady but full of conviction. Victoria's expression faltered for the briefest of moments, but it was enough. David watched in stunned silence as Kelsey walked up to the millionaire and handed him the envelope. As he took it from her, he hesitated, then tore it open, his fingers trembling. The contents were brief, one line of text, written in the same handwriting as the note David had given him earlier. But it was different. The words inside were simple, yet world-shattering. Asterisk, it's not too late to make it right, asterisk. Sebastian's face drained of color, his legs almost giving way beneath him as he took in the message. The shock was written all over him, his hands trembling as he looked at Kelsey and then at Victoria. The woman he had once controlled, the woman who had seemed so sure of herself, now appeared shaken for the first time. David's breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. There was more at play here than anyone had understood. Kelsey had played her part in this too, and with that, the final twist landed. The woman who had seemed like the villain, Victoria, wasn't the true mastermind. It had been Kelsey all along. The daughter of the Johnsons, quiet and observant, had been the one to set this entire thing into motion. She had known the key to breaking the cycle of cruelty and arrogance. She had known how to bring Sebastian Warren to his knees, and now she was about to change everything. The restaurant fell silent once more, but this time, it wasn't just the calm before the storm. It was the moment of reckoning. The room remained eerily still, the weight of Kelsey's revelation hanging in the air like an electric current. Sebastian Warren, still holding the envelope in his trembling hands, stood frozen, as though he was no longer part of this world. His eyes darted from Kelsey to Victoria, to the Johnsons, and then back to the officers who had just entered the room. He couldn't seem to make sense of what was happening, his thoughts racing, trying to grasp onto something solid, something that could explain the unexplainable. Kelsey's expression was calm, resolute. She didn't flinch under the gaze of the millionaire or the tension that pulsed through the room. Her eyes were clear and determined. She had known this moment was coming. But for all her composure, there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the entire restaurant had taken a collective breath, waiting for the next move. "You?" Sebastian muttered, finally finding his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "You've been playing me this whole time. All of you." He looked at the Johnsons now, his gaze more incredulous than accusatory. "Even you. You were in on this. With her?" David stood frozen, still processing the chain of events that had led them here. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Kelsey to be the one pulling the strings all along. He had been caught up in the rush of revenge, in the drive to expose the millionaire for everything he had done to his family. But Kelsey had seen something deeper, something more. She had a plan from the very beginning, a plan that had now come to fruition. "Not in the way you think," Kelsey replied, her voice calm but firm. "This wasn't just about getting back at you, Sebastian. This wasn't about humiliating you for one dinner. This was about showing you that there are consequences to your actions, that no one is above accountability, not even you." David's mind spun as he took in her words. Kelsey had never once shown any sign of animosity towards Sebastian, but now he understood why. She had been working in the background, quietly studying the situation, gathering information, and waiting for the perfect moment. All this time, she had been the one driving the narrative, pulling the strings to expose the millionaire's true nature. But it wasn't just for her family's sake, it was for justice, for everyone Sebastian had ever wronged. Sebastian's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. I don't understand. How did you?" He trailed off, his voice cracking as the enormity of the situation seemed to dawn on him. Kelsey didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced at the officers, who were still standing by the door, their eyes vigilant. The lead officer took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "Sebastian Warren," he said, his voice firm. "You are under arrest for numerous counts of fraud, embezzlement, and other criminal activities spanning several years. Your actions have harmed countless individuals, and the evidence against you is undeniable." The words hung in the air like a judgment. Sebastian looked like he might collapse under the weight of them. His empire, his wealth, his carefully curated life, all of it had come crashing down in a single devastating moment. It was over. The life he had built on deception and manipulation had unraveled before his eyes. Victoria, who had been a silent observer throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke. "I tried to warn you, Sebastian. You should have stepped back when you had the chance." Her voice was cold, distant, almost as if she were no longer concerned with his fate. "But you couldn't let go of the power. And now you've lost everything." Sebastian didn't respond. He didn't have to. The officers were already moving in, and as they began to escort him out of the restaurant, he glanced at Kelsey one last time. There was no hatred in his eyes, just disbelief. David watched as the millionaire was led away, his mind still reeling. It was hard to reconcile the man he had spent so many years loathing with the defeated figure that was now being escorted through the restaurant. In that moment, all the anger, all the resentment seemed to fade away. The humiliation he had suffered, the hurt his family had endured, it was all overshadowed by the realization that the real victory wasn't in seeing Sebastian Warren brought down. It was in knowing that Kelsey had orchestrated this from the start, that she had seen the bigger picture. As the officers disappeared into the night with Sebastian in tow, the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. The Johnsons, who had been swept up in this whirlwind of events, looked at each other, their expressions softening. They had come to the restaurant expecting a simple meal, and now they found themselves part of a story that was far bigger than anything they had ever imagined. David could see the understanding in their eyes, the realization that they had just witnessed the fall of a man who had caused so much pain. Kelsey turned to them then, her expression gentle. "I'm sorry you had to be part of all this," she said quietly. "But I hope you understand why it had to happen this way." Mr. Johnson nodded slowly. "We do," he said, his voice steady. "And we're grateful. It's just hard to believe it's all over." Kelsey smiled softly. "It's over. For now. But remember, the fight for justice doesn't end here. There are more people like him out there. People who think they're untouchable. And it's up to us to make sure they know they're wrong." David felt a sense of closure wash over him, a weight lifting off his shoulders. The battle had been long, and there had been moments when he wasn't sure if they would win. But now, with Sebastian Warren exposed and taken down, there was a sense of peace. His family would never forget what had happened, but they could begin to heal. As the restaurant began to empty out, the once charged atmosphere fading into something softer, David found himself looking at Kelsey with newfound respect. She had been the quiet force behind all of this, the one who had seen through the smoke and mirrors, who had understood the bigger picture when no one else did. She had played her role perfectly, never seeking the spotlight but always staying true to the cause. In that moment, David realized that sometimes the most powerful voices aren't the loudest. They're the ones who speak when it matters most. As the last of the patrons filtered out of the restaurant, Kelsey and David exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had transpired. They had won. They had exposed the truth, and in doing so, they had changed the course of their lives forever. But even as they stood there in the quiet aftermath of it all, David couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to come. The world they lived in was full of people like Sebastian Warren, and while one battle had been won, the war for justice was far from over. The fight for what was right would continue. And for Kelsey, for David, and for the Johnsons, that was a fight they would never stop fighting.